This is the story of Daniel Arap Moi, who was Kenya's president for 24 years from the year 1978 to 2002. His is a story of a man who is widely held responsible for a regime that bore witness to and benefited from violence, corruption, and discrimination. Moi refined Kenya's culture of corruption and impunity, which he inherited from his predecessor, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's first president. Moi's regime was so corrupt that at one point the IMF and the World Bank stopped lending money to Kenya. At the same time, he is widely credited with bringing stability to Kenya during the 1980s. Moi is also lauded for his decision to reintroduce multi-party politics in the early 1990s and the peaceful handover of power in 2002. In this episode of African Biographics, we look at the improbable rise to power of Daniel Arap Moi and how he became one of Africa's most corrupt and ruthless autocrats. The man known as Toroitish Arap Moi was born on 2 September 1924 into a farming family in Baringo County, Midwestern Kenya. He later adopted the name Daniel when, as a schoolboy, he was baptized by Christian missionaries. The young man spent his early years in Baringo with his brother, tending the few sheep and goats left by his father, Kimoi Arap Chebi, who was a herdsman who died when Moi was only 4 years old. In a country in which ethnicity is still perhaps the most important factor in power manipulation, Moi belonged to a relatively small and at the time powerless Kalenjin group. This is a very important point for this story, so hold on to it. His paternal uncle sent him to a Protestant missionary primary school, and this is where he took the Christian name of Daniel. Being at this school turned him into a staunch lifelong follower of the evangelical church. His first paid job was to relocate cattle for a missionary, spending 3 days on the road and living off wild fruits to earn 2 shillings, which he spent on a copy of the Bible translated into Kalenjin. From here, he went on to another missionary school for his secondary education before joining the government school, which was 160 kilometers from his home. According to various accounts, Daniel Arap Moi was a diligent, hard-working, and popular student and had an above-average intelligence. Upon completing school, Daniel Arap Moi opted to go to a teacher training college. He became a very successful teacher and then assistant principal of a teacher training college. Through his role as a teacher, together with his regular church attendance and position on various boards and committees, Moi quickly developed a reputation with colonial officials for hard work, sobriety, and being dependable. Because of this, he was viewed as a potential moderate African leader. This provided the right platform for him to enter into politics. In October 1955, Daniel Arap Moi became a member of the Legislative Council of Kenya, and he was one of 5 Africans nominated by the British colonial government. At the time, Kenya was a British colony. Moi was the chosen replacement of Dr. John Ole Tameno, the former representative who had quit due to heavy drinking and because of his suspected connections to the freedom movement. During Kenya's struggle for independence, Daniel Arap Moi played no part in the Mau Mau rebellion but was sympathetic to the movement to gain independence from the British. At the height of the Mau Mau uprising, it is said that Arap Moi even sheltered 5 Mau Mau rebels on his farm for several weeks. In March of 1957, Moi was re-elected to the Legislative Council, and early in 1960, he was one of the African delegates to the Lancaster House Conference in London, which drafted a new Kenyan constitution granting black people a majority in the Legislative Council. That same year, in the run-up to Kenya's independence, Moi and other politicians who represented the smaller ethnic groups left Kenyatta's Kenya African National Union, KANU, to form their own party, the Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU. The aim of this move was to neutralize the dominance of Kenya's 2 main dominant ethnicities, the Kikuyu, to which Kenyatta belonged, and the Luo. Well, KADU lost to KANU in the first general election in 1963. And after Kenya gained independence on the 12th of December 1963, Kenyatta convinced Arap Moi that KADU and KANU should be merged to make the process of decolonization easier. Accordingly, KADU was dissolved and joined KANU in 1964. Arap Moi was appointed as the Minister of Home Affairs and he became a loyal ally of the then President Jomo Kenyatta. Moi's position as Home Affairs Minister made him the head of Kenya's national police and charged him with the responsibility for maintaining national security. Now, let me circle back to the issue of ethnicity that I raised earlier. In the past, issues related to ethnicity have been a very big deal in Kenya, just like in many other African countries. Daniel Arap Moi was one of the few politicians who belonged to neither of the main ethnic groups. Under normal circumstances, he was never going to reach the upper echelons of power because of his tribe, but the fact that he belonged to a smaller tribe ended up working in his favor. Moi's unwavering loyalty to the seat of power, coupled with his position as the preeminent Kalenjin politician, explains why Jomo Kenyatta decided to appoint him as his vice president in 1967. Daniel Arap Moi wasn't seen as a threatening figure. He was seen as a convenient outsider and one who owed everything to the president, Jomo Kenyatta. Kenyatta's own group of Kikuyu politicians had been fighting for dominance in his administration, so Arap Moi was seen as a safer option. These same factors helped Moi ascend to the presidency upon Kenyatta's death. Jomo Kenyatta died in August of 1978, and according to the constitution, Daniel Arap Moi as vice president became the interim president for an interim period of 90 days. As expected, a bitter succession fight ensued between the two competing groups of Kikuyu political heavyweights within the ruling party, KANU. In all of this, Daniel Arap Moi was seen as a neutral who lacked an ethnic base of any importance. So eventually he was made president because he was seen as a unifier. The Kikuyu politicians who squabbled over succeeding Kenyatta let Moi come to power on the theory that they could easily manipulate him and toss him aside later. But that was a disastrous miscalculation on their part. A few years down the road, Moi divided and conquered the Kikuyu, shuffling the army and internal security commands into the hands of his tribesmen and allies. He let corruption flourish to buy off his more pliable opponents using harsher measures against others. But this is not what transpired from the onset of his rule. At the time, the mood in the country was quite buoyant. In the beginning of his rule, Daniel Arap Moi was embraced and accepted by Kenyans. And for sure, Moi's first few years in office were quite promising. He employed the philosophy of Nyayo, which means footsteps, with the central theme of the philosophy being peace, love and unity in Kenya. He also launched an anti-corruption campaign and worked to lessen Kikuyu political dominance. During the honeymoon period, Moi released all political detainees and prisoners, focused on having an all-inclusive government, and exhibited populist policies that endeared him to the majority of the population. He announced popular measures such as free milk and education for children, and this actually helped boost the school attendance rate in Kenya. But for Kenya, the honeymoon was short-lived. Behind these exhibitions of compassion, openness, politics of inclusion and populism, Moi started displaying the characteristics of a typical autocrat. Things in Kenya under Daniel Arap Moi started going south after August of 1982, and here's why. On the 1st of August, the Air Force mounted a coup in Nairobi and seized key points in the city, which they held for a day until the Army and the General Service Unit regained control. Officially, only 159 people were killed, though the number of deaths was much higher. Some 2,000 Air Force personnel and 1,000 civilians were detained. In this instance, the coup leaders claimed that corruption and restrictions on freedom in the country were the reasons for their action. 12 airmen and 2 leaders who had fled to Tanzania and were later repatriated to Kenya to stand trial were sentenced to death. Later that month, President Moi disbanded the Air Force. The whole incident gave Moi the opportunity to consolidate his power by expelling those suspected of being behind the plot from government and by ushering in a one-party state by way of changing the constitution. Those groups that opposed this move were repressed. One of the more prominent public officials that Daniel Arap Moi targeted to purge from his government was a man by the name Charles Njonjo. Njonjo was an influential Attorney General and seen as the kingmaker of 1978 as he helped ensure that Moi's succession to Kenyatta went smoothly. By 1982, Charles Njonjo had traded his appointment as Attorney General for the more vulnerable office of a cabinet minister. Now, by 1982, Daniel Arap Moi started feeling threatened by Charles Njonjo as he saw him as being too powerful, and so he set about destroying him. Njonjo was accused of being a stooge of a foreign power working to replace Moi and was publicly disgraced. Eventually, Moi pardoned Njonjo, although his political and public image had been tarnished. In another case of political repression, the internationally esteemed foreign minister Robert Uwoko was brutally killed after he publicly denounced the abuse of office by Moi and called for a probe into corruption allegations against Moi's regime. Daniel Arap Moi increased his grip on power in 1986 when control of the civil service was transferred to the president's office, as was the power to dismiss the Attorney General, the Auditor General, and judges, thus lessening the independence of the judiciary. And so, within a decade of his ascension to power, Daniel Arap Moi had now presided over the making of Kenya a de jure one-party state, and in the process compromising the independence of the judiciary and the legislature. During Daniel Arap Moi's rule, there was unprecedented corruption in Kenya as well as great economic decline. His regime was so corrupt that at one point in 1997, the IMF and the World Bank stopped lending money to Kenya. The biggest single corruption scandal under Moi was first made public in 1992. Known as the Goldenberg Affair, it centered on the theft of about $600 million of public money that was paid as state subsidies to a company called Goldenberg International to promote fictitious exports of Kenyan gold and diamonds. Well, like many other governments around the world, the Kenyan government had put in place a policy that encouraged international trade by granting tax-free status to commercial enterprises involved in the export of goods and sometimes subsidized these exports. While this was meant for the greater good of Kenya's economy, it created an opportunity for fraudulent activities to pop up. At the time, gold mining represented a tiny portion of Kenya's GDP with only one operational gold mine. So now, in this instance of blatant corruption, Goldenberg International allegedly developed a scheme of smuggling gold into Kenya from Congo so that they could legally export it at the higher export price offered by the Kenyan government and also earn the subsidies from the government. Now, this scandal was perpetrated at a time of severe economic austerity in Kenya, with foreign reserves dwindling and the country experiencing a long period of macroeconomic instability. The sad part of this was that it took 14 years for fraud charges to be brought against, among others, the company's director, the former Treasury Permanent Secretary, and the former Deputy Director of Kenya's Central Bank. An official inquiry suggested that President Moi must have known about what was going on, but he always denied involvement and was never charged. When Daniel Arap Moi was eventually obliged to leave power at the end of 2002, investigators estimated that he and his cronies had looted as much as $3 billion. In 2007, there was a secret report that leaked, and it showed the breathtaking extent of corruption that was perpetrated by Daniel Arap Moi and his family. This report laid bare a web of shell companies, secret trusts and frontmen that Moi and his cronies used to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars into nearly 30 countries around the world, including the UK. The report alleged that they accumulated assets which included multi-million-pound properties in London, New York and South Africa, as well as a 10,000-hectare ranch in Australia and bank accounts containing hundreds of millions of dollars. Meanwhile, as all of this looting was happening, the government's poverty eradication schemes failed to yield meaningful results. Consequently, the unemployment rate in Kenya spiraled out of control and poverty continued to afflict the majority of the population. As the decade ending 1989 was coming to a close, Daniel Arap Moi was starting to come under intense political and economic pressure both from within and outside to allow for multipartyism and embrace economic reforms or risk losing economic aid. So Daniel Arap Moi reluctantly succumbed to the pressure and presided over the repeal of the one-party clause in the constitution, thus allowing multipartyism in Kenya. But Moi wasn't going to take this lying down. Of course, he turned to the playbook of the autocrats to grip on to power. He used the strategies of divide and rule and scare tactics. On the eve of the multi-party elections of 1992, ethnic clashes erupted in the Rift Valley, Nyanza, and Coast provinces of Kenya. These clashes were aimed at the so-called non-indigenous people who would sway the election in favor of a candidate from one of the major ethnic groups and not Arap Moi. Many years later, a parliamentary commission of inquiry into these clashes implicated Moi's government for being behind some of the violence that occurred in these provinces. In the two multi-party elections of 1992 and 1997, in addition to suspicions of vote fraud, what also helped Moi emerge as a victor was a divided opposition. Although he was re-elected in 1997 to serve his last term as the president of Kenya, he had to contend with economic stagnation and agitation for constitutional reform. The agitation for constitutional reform intensified with the civil society calling for drastic changes aimed at strengthening institutions as well as curtailing the powers of the office of the president. People had had enough of Moi's shenanigans. As he was now in his final term, Moi was clever enough to read the room, and so he didn't try to change the constitution to give himself another term in power. The political climate in Kenya was too tense and volatile for such a thing. So in the year 2001, he began to prepare for his departure and ensure his own future. In this regard, Arap Moi appointed to parliament Uhuru Kenyatta, the businessman's son of the first president, quickly promoted him to Minister for Local Government and groomed him to lead KANU. Essentially, Moi became a mentor to the inexperienced Kenyatta. Not only did this enrage the old party veterans of KANU, who were also waiting for their turn at the gravy train, but Kenya's opposition parties managed to unite after a decade of squabbling. Together, these parties produced an upset victory in the 2002 election that humiliated both Uhuru Kenyatta and his mentor, Daniel Arap Moi. So Moi was forced to hand over power to Mwai Kibaki, formerly a key member of KANU, who was at one point his vice president and had now become a vocal critic of his. And that was it for Daniel Arap Moi. His time in power had come to an end. After leaving office in December of 2002, Daniel Arap Moi lived in retirement, largely shunned by the political establishment. However, he still retained some popularity with the masses. He even scored some diplomacy gigs around the continent of Africa due to his stature as an elder statesman. Daniel Arap Moi died on the 4th of February 2020 at the age of 95. Daniel Arap Moi's legacy somewhat divides opinions. His supporters can point to Kenya's relative stability during the 1980s, his decision to reintroduce multi-party politics in the early 1990s, and the peaceful handover of power in 2002. In contrast, his critics can point to the problems that his regimes oversaw and to the centralization of power, culture of corruption and impunity, and the sense of an ethnically biased state with which Kenyans still grapple with today. Let me know in the comment section below what your thoughts are on Daniel Arap Moi's legacy. Don't forget to like and share the video if you enjoyed it. Thank you all for tuning in. This has been Tatenda for African Biographics. Until next time, cheers. Have a good one.